In Ethiopia's Bali highlands, just north of the equator and 14,000 feet up, there lives a dog that lives nowhere else on Earth. It's a simian jackal. Its world is like the Arctic tundra, but although it freezes every night, it thaws every day. Instead of lemmings, there are rats, and they're just as plentiful. There are 100,000 grass rats alone per square mile. Where there is a place for an animal here, it's usually a rat that has filled it. This is true even when that place calls for a creature that weighs up to 3 pounds, can dig tunnels, and has a bird to support. A giant mole rat pulls vegetation into its burrow while a hill chat waits for the exposed grubs. The big mole rat is the jackal's favorite prey, and that in turn makes the mole rat extremely cautious and reluctant to forage far from its hole. Most of the rats here burrow, and the plateau's ground is a honeycomb. Because its prey lives this way, the jackal's snout is longer than most dogs. It's a pointed tool for underground exploration. A giant mole rat's maze is complex and extensive, and there's no profit for a jackal in trying to dig it up. A smaller rat will have to do. Nowhere else is there such a thing as a giant mole rat, or many of the other species of rat found here, or a simian jackal, and there are only 1,000 of those. Theirs is an exclusive world, and an ancient one. The landscape is strewn with boulders left behind by Ice Age glaciers. European alpine plants, their seeds brought in by winds or birds, flourish beside African giant lobelias. These mountains were the very first signs of the geological storm that was to become the Rift Valley itself. Before Africa's crust actually split open, this part of the continent perforated. The lava oozed through, adding layers upon layers, so that hot flatlands became cold uplands. And on the sides of the mountains, below the tree line, there's another animal that exists nowhere else. The mountain Nyala. The remoteness of these highlands has meant that they were almost the last parts of Africa to be explored by Europeans, and the mountain Nyala was not discovered for science until 1910. It is shy, and not much is known about it even now. Because the only place it lives is small and cut off, there are only about 2,000 of them. These ancient mountains have had a lot of time to build and refine a unique collection of creatures, such as the blue-winged goose, whose nearest relatives live in the South American Andes. Rouget's rail is another bird found only here. So is the wattled ibis. In fact, most of the animals of the Ethiopian highlands have evolved to live nowhere else. It's as if they were on an island of altitude. And below the mountains, on the floor of the Rift Valley, are the seas of grass connecting arid North Africa and the plains of Kenya and Tanzania. Summering's gazelles are as much at home here as in the Sahara to the north. Besa oryx, too, are creatures of the deserts and plains, and their range stretches 1,500 miles from the Red Sea coast into Kenya and Tanzania. When the rift shattered these plains, fragments were forced up and down, isolating the life on each one. But the corridors of flatland still hold the sea of grass, where the species are few and the individuals abundant. And the crust is still breaking. Here at the volcano Fantali is the crust at its most brittle. The collapsed crater is relatively young and is 1/4 mile deep. Inside, the mountain is still molten, and ordinary springs emerge from the mountainside as steam. A lava flow on Fantali's flanks looks as if it were made just yesterday. A volcanic spring harbors the only organism that can stand the heat, algae. But its heat notwithstanding, it supports a more complicated creature, one that evolved to adjust to a variety of habitats. This is the Hamadryas baboon. It lives throughout the Ethiopian highlands and has a special talent for living in dry, unwelcoming places such as this. In the Rift's archipelago of isolated habitats, baboons are island hoppers. They have flourished mainly because with their four-legged way of walking, they're good at traveling across open spaces. And they can take advantage of whatever is available wherever they are. Obviously, they need water, and if the only water around is hot, they'll drink it hot. In fact, on Fantali volcano, the hot springs are the centers of the troops' territories, and the baboons guard them from other baboons. Fantali sits above one of the mightiest rivers in East Africa, the Awash. Most of the water that drains off the Ethiopian highlands eventually finds its way into the Awash Gorge, and from there flows over the edge of what amounts to the world's largest hole in the ground, the 58,000 square mile Afar Triangle, sinking to more than 400 feet below sea level. In all of Africa, this region, where the surface of the earth literally can be as hot as a frying pan, has been the most unexplored by outsiders. As recently as the 1930s, it was assumed that somewhere the Awash flowed into the sea. But in 1934, the Englishman Wilfred Thesiger followed the mighty river to its bitter end, the great evaporating pan called Lac Abbé. Here, part of the Awash evaporates, and part of it settles into the ground to form a huge subterranean lake. The water in that lake is often so close to the molten inside of the planet that it boils, and its steam flows back into the air through towering chimneys of mineral salts. Thesiger called this an infernal place. Throughout the hottest hours, he wrote, we crouched among the rocks, our heads swathed in cloths, wondering if we should have the strength left to continue. And yet, adapted to living even here are humans, the Afar people. Their well water is sulfurous, hot and muddy, but it can still be drunk. Water and the occasional patch of scrub is all it takes to build a thriving nomadic culture, one that, like its surroundings, is fierce. The Afar Triangle is like the epicenter of the Great Rift. It is pure volcano. The air is heavy and hard to breathe. Water infused with lava salts bubbles up and evaporates, leaving grotesque formations in strange colors. Lava itself bubbles up in pools and overflows and hardens. It used to be the bottom of the sea, but mountains grew up and isolated it, and the water evaporated. Throughout the Afar's turbulent past, this happened again and again. The salt left behind by successive evaporations lies 3,000 feet thick, and salt is valuable. Where there is something valuable, there are humans willing to retrieve it and sell it. A day's pay for one of these men is a goat skin of water, a loaf of bread, and a small amount of money. But it's a day's pay that makes this bleak existence even possible. Physically, these people are no different from any others, and yet they work their whole lives in glare and temperatures that would blind or kill almost anyone else. As the Great Rift grows, it may rupture and destroy this hellish world. One small section of the Afar Triangle is forming a new arm of the rift. It is splitting away from the continent at such a rate you can almost see it move. And in the middle of this great fissure is the volcano Aducuba. To the north of Aducuba is its lava field, dissected by a 7-mile-long crack that is 4 feet wide and growing. And farther north still is a lake, Lac Assal. At first sight, it seems to be a miracle. A disconnected, though salt-encrusted body of water in the middle of the hottest and driest of deserts. But the water is coming from the Red Sea, seeping under Aducuba and its lava field. The crack is widening so fast, they say that if you put a stick across it in the morning and come back in the evening, it will have fallen in. Someday the rupture will come, the sea will break through, and a new valley will be populated by reefs and fishes. It will not be the first time. Seashells tell us the sea has been here before. Long ago, the continent was torn asunder when the rift ruptured in 2 directions. Arabia was ripped right off the top of the Afar Triangle, and the Red Sea was born as a thin finger of the Indian Ocean. As ice ages have caused sea levels to rise and fall, the Red Sea has repeatedly expanded and contracted. Now the sea level is rising. Waters from the Indian Ocean spill from the Gulf of Aden into the Red Sea. The Gulf itself is simply a large part of the Indian Ocean, and its reef and the creatures that live on it are more or less the same throughout. And yet, despite the exchange of waters, there are fish found in the Gulf that don't exist in the Red Sea. But the ocean pours through the strait, carrying nutrients into the warm, salty sea. It's a good feeding ground for any fish, including a Queensland shark. Near the mouth of the Red Sea, currents become something like an underwater hurricane, and specially adapted fast current creatures appear. Corals as tough as oak trees, or as flexible as grass. Christmas tree worms specialize in grabbing the plankton that is rushing by. Barracuda, used to the open seas, shoot through the strait with no trouble. The Strait of Bab el-Mandeb is the remains of a barrier that once kept the Indian Ocean out of the Red Sea. Now it's below sea level, a sandy, flat shelf. Any bottom-living animal that crosses here has to spend a long time in the open, in full view of predators. Something that's no problem to a stingray with its defensive tail spike and its ability to dig for food. But a sea urchin, in spite of its formidable spines, is less able to stand the exposure. A triggerfish comes in for the first helping. Other fish wait like vultures for the kill. The triggerfish's way of disarming the urchin is to blow it over and bare its soft, delectable underside. Any creature that is not adapted to swimming in open water or defending itself in the sand is not going to make the long journey across the strait. To some forms of life, the Bab el-Mandeb is still as great a barrier as it ever was. Plankton, however, does wash through the strait. It's made up of the eggs and larvae of many creatures, probably the form in which most of them cross the strait. And swimming with them are the plankton feeders, including the largest fish in the world, the whale shark. These rare giants, reaching lengths of 40 feet, slowly cruise the sunlit waters for plankton and schools of small fish. A great diversity of corals has colonized the steep walls of the Red Sea. They enter as plankton, attach themselves to the tops of rock walls, grow, and form the base for a community of reef fishes peculiar to the Red Sea. New species have evolved. In the strong surge zone behind the strait is a surgeonfish that exists nowhere else, and nowhere else in the Red Sea. These orange eggs are laid only on rocks which are protected by this particular sea anemone. The clownfish that lays and fertilizes them only lives in the Red Sea. In the still waters, the fry settle on an anemone, waiting for a permanent space when they are grown. They live under the protection of the venomous tentacles of an anemone their entire lives. More than 20% of the fishes in the Red Sea are exclusive to it, And the 10 members of the dottyback family are all exclusive. These orchid dottybacks are so oriented to the reef surface that it can alter their sense of up and down. Half of the 14 butterfly fishes live only here, a solitary crown butterfly fish. Gregarious mask butterfly fish. The corals here have adapted to a sea that is very salty, has very small tides and seasonal changes, disturbed only by fresh water from sudden and violent bursts of rain. As in any isolated place, this means that there are fewer species, but that they're doing very well. This applies to fish too. In the Indian Ocean, shoals of anthias are small and sparse, but here in the Red Sea, their shoals are massive and dominate the reef tops. What the rift has done in forming the Red Sea is to make an island out of a piece of ocean. It's just as much a world of its own as all the isolated habitats of the rift. It's an embryo ocean, unlike any other ocean on Earth. And a fertile sea is important to more than just the animals which swim. White-eyed gulls, also found nowhere else. They are, in a way, another Red Sea reef dweller. The occasional barren islet such as this is simply the top of a reef that has been exposed by falling sea level. To breed here, the gulls must solve a serious problem. The sea is richest in summer, but the island is blistering hot. As with any bird, the main concern is to keep the chicks fed. Here, they must also be kept cool. At the nest, parents provide shade, subjecting themselves to as much heat as a bird can take. In the soaring temperatures, the parents take turns acting as a parasol and a provider of Red Sea plenty. Panting is a way of expelling heat, of literally taking the heat out of the body and blowing it into the air. The shading goes on past the point when the chick can fit underneath. Mother and father work in shifts. After about a week, the chicks are too large to seek shade under a parent. The sea takes over. It's one more animal that has learned to cope with conditions created exclusively by the Great Rift. Another Red Sea island, another way of coping. A heap of driftwood and shells brought together for a purpose. If it weren't built on the ground, you would call it an eyrie. The bird is an osprey. The male brings the food. The female stays on the nest, shades the chicks, pants the heat away. A familiar bird is solving the very specific Red Sea problems in a fairly ordinary way. Or is it? These birds can't stand the extreme heat that the white-eyed gull has evolved to tolerate. They breed in winter. But the reef does not supply as much food then. A possible solution? An extra supplier. It's the only place in the world where female ospreys receive food from two males. The birds didn't evolve into a new species, but made fundamental adjustments in their way of doing things. White storks use the Red Sea islands as stepping stones on a grueling journey from East Europe and Asia to East Africa. Some become victims of exhaustion. Every autumn, the sky over the rift is filled with millions of birds that have left Europe and Asia to fly to Africa. They are using the rift as a highway because its prominent features guide them on their way and upwellings of hot air, thermals, give them a lift. These pelicans are flying over Israel. This, the northern corridor of the rift, takes them over cities, farmland, and lush green meadows to the Red Sea. All the soaring birds, including storks and birds of prey that migrate to Africa from Eastern Europe, follow this flight path. Flying south down the Red Sea, they hug the African coastline, riding the thermals rising from the land. At the southern end of the Red Sea, they sail over the Afar Triangle and on into Africa. These white storks may end up on the grasslands of East Africa, in the Serengeti, or perhaps in the shadow of Kilimanjaro. The rift has built new worlds in old landscapes, made an island of a sea, and created a navigable river of air. Many times in the past, a land bridge crossed the mouth of the Red Sea. From the African side of the strait, it is possible to see Arabia, only miles away. And for another group of soaring birds, the bridge still functions. They are steppe eagles and other birds of prey that come mainly from Central and Eastern Asia. Instead of using the Red Sea corridor, they fly across land to the tip of the Arabian Peninsula. On its entire journey, the strait between Arabia and Africa is the most water this Russian steppe eagle has had to cross. The wind has to be right, and if it isn't, all the birds wait together on the Arabian side and finally make a dash for it on the same breeze. Without thermals to ride, they will have to flap their wings before reaching landfall and the first warm uprush. In the future, the distant descendants of these birds may have to cross a wider strait. The Red Sea is spreading at a rate of nearly an inch a year. One day it will be an ocean, and when oceans grow, continents are torn apart. The Arabian Peninsula was once joined to Africa, its southeastern corner once part of the Ethiopian highlands. A land bridge where animals crossed existed relatively recently, but even so, Arabia's isolation is already evident in its wildlife. Arabian oryx. Once an ancestral oryx grazed the grassy flatlands on both sides of the young rift. Then the Red Sea formed and widened. The land of Arabia gradually became a desert. The oryx's hooves spread for a foothold in pebbles and sand and to carry the animal's weight over formidable distances. Its coat turned white to reflect the sun. It became smaller and needed less food. The population became smaller too, but in the vast Arabian desert, these oryxes became less solitary than their African cousins and live in herds of mixed age and sex, seeking out trees for shade. But most of all, they developed the ability to live without having to drink very often. Over succeeding generations, they became a new species, perfectly fit to exist in the splendid isolation in which they found themselves. On the African side of the Red Sea, high in the Afar Mountains, is a 3,500-acre forest. There are juniper trees here, olives, figs, box trees, and jasmine, plants more characteristic of the Mediterranean than of East Africa. It is known as a mist oasis. Clouds from the Red Sea rise up the hillsides and gently settle, bringing a blanket of moisture. It's a haven for birds familiar in forests elsewhere in Africa. Hoopoe. Redstart. Shrike. White-eye. A small land animal can't cross the barriers the way birds can. The chameleon is imprisoned here. This forest would be the only mist oasis but for one event, the rift. Directly across the Red Sea in Arabia is its other half, almost exactly the same. But here in Africa, the forest is under attack. It's been discovered by the Afar herds, and their grazing is destroying the understory. It's the understory that catches and holds the clouds of mist, and many parts of the forest, particularly the juniper trees, are dying of thirst. It's possible that except for some gnarled skeletons of juniper, the whole oasis could vanish without a trace. The Red Sea isn't the only part of the Great Rift that's widening. It's pushing apart down its entire length, and one day, all of East Africa might be separated by sea from the rest of the continent. It won't be the first time a rift has broken off a piece of Africa. 165 million years ago, another rift split Madagascar away, and the result of this isolation is strange and extraordinary. Looking at it might give us an idea about the far distant future of East Africa. Nearly every plant on Madagascar is unique to it. Lemurs, evolved from ancestors of the monkeys, are the main mammalian life form and exist in scores of shapes and sizes. Tenrecs, ancient hedgehog-like insectivores, also live here. But perhaps the most unusual feature of Madagascar is the spiny forest, a jungle of cactus-like plants all exclusive to the island. Searing daytime temperatures of 112 degrees and a limited water supply have molded the succulent leaves protected by long spines. When Madagascar split off from Africa, there were comparatively few plant species. The ones that did exist flourished in the absence of competition. For instance, there is one surviving species of baobab tree in Africa. In Madagascar, there are 7. Shefox, white lemurs, the only daytime mammal in this hostile place. At dawn, they sunbathe to get warm. Later, they will shelter to get cool. The hardships of a leafy diet, dehydration, thirst, and heat stroke have ensured little competition. A specialized gut can cope with large quantities of seemingly unpalatable leaves. To forage, they leap from tree to tree, using their powerful legs. Their coat is another adaptation. The fur is thick for warmth through the chilly nights. It is white to reflect the hot sunlight. Except for dew they lick from their fur in the morning, shefox never drink water directly. The spiny forest's leaves give them all they need. Although the spiny forest is usually too hot and dry for most animals, at a certain time of year, almost everything there flowers at once. It's an annual feast, attracting visitors from all over the island. The sunbird normally lives in rainforest. Gray-headed lovebirds, known only here in Madagascar, are of African origin. Black parrots, also Madagascan, but with Asian origins. Sickle-billed vanga. The vangas are another family that adapted well, developing different shaped bills, each one designed for a different way of feeding. Midday, heat, emptiness. Even reptiles, which can usually endure heat, are affected by 112 degrees. A Madagascan radiated tortoise makes for shade. And a chameleon looks for shelter among murderous thorns. Chameleons have been more successful in Madagascar than anywhere. Their ancestors arrived to find a world without competition, and now there are nearly 30 different kinds, from finger-sized to 3 feet long, from the smallest in the world to the largest. Time, too, for the shifox to look for shade. Running sporadically through the spiny forest are seasonal rivers whose beds are usually dry. They are shaded by galleries of trees, and one of these is where today the shifox will retire from the sun. To cross the exposed riverbed, shifox bring their distinctive leaping style down from the trees to cover the open ground. Siesta time in the gallery is a time for grooming and other easygoing social activities. There is another lemur that uses the spiny forest, but is more of a foraging visitor than a resident. It usually spends its time in gallery forests. Ring-tailed lemurs are conspicuous because of their extreme sociability. They live in troops of 10 or 20, constantly calling, chattering, parading, grooming, and play-fighting. There are about 30 species of lemurs on Madagascar, not all monkey-like. Some resemble cats, mice, or squirrels. But they all had the same ancestors, which arrived about 40 million years ago. One theory is that they floated over from Africa on a raft of matted vegetation. Until the arrival of humans only 1,500 years ago, they had little to fear. But the events of that short time have had a greater impact on the lemurs than anything in the millions of years before. In fact, for the inhabitants of all those worlds that developed in isolation, for the animals that have learned to fit perfectly in one and only one place, there is the threat of human intrusion, a threat that originated here in the great African rift. Even the thundering, brutal world of the African plains can be affected by man. About 100,000 years ago, somewhere near here, humans evolved with hands, big brains, and a prodigious ability to travel. Almost immediately, they expanded into the rest of Africa and over the Red Sea land bridges into the rest of the world.
Well, doesn't it usually say?
Now they return, seeking the wild Africa that's disappearing before the relentless encroachment of civilization. Humans now fly faster than a stork or a pelican and look down upon the changes other humans have brought to the landscape. The Maasai and their herds. Farming on the rich, well-watered volcanic soils of the Great Rift Highlands. Wheat, tea. And down in the rift itself, there are crops that are suited for the hot, dry lowlands. Sisal, a plant used to make many kinds of fibers. Rich soil produces crops. Rivers and subterranean heat yield hydroelectric and geothermal power. The rift is mined for salt. Even a caustic lake can support a soda factory, which produces tons of it from a supply that never seems to diminish. Mankind has found uses for places that before had only been used by certain extreme specialists. Lesser flamingos evolved to use the algae of the Rift Valley salt lakes, but lost the ability to live anywhere else. Specialization is fine as long as there is no drastic change. But if the future of the rift causes the lakes to disappear, the flamingos might disappear too. The Ethiopian highlands, as they slowly erode, become gradually less suitable to the present form of giant mole rat. Over time, it will have to change or disappear, and so will the simian jackal, already endangered by man competing for its land. On the Virunga volcanoes, the mountain gorillas have had a stay of execution in the only place they live. Their forests are protected, and they are now a valuable natural resource as tourist attractions. Like it or not, we are both their nemesis and their salvation. The Great Rift of Africa, which created a bewildering number of life forms, created one that could deliberately change nature. What we do with our power is up to us. But one thing is sure, the Rift Valley will go on changing and will outlive us all.